So welcome to Phenomenal Conversation 25. I'm interviewing Jenny Andersson on the topic of the regenerative power and potential of place. So Jenny, I know you've already had a long career and done a lot in your life, but we focus on the latter part in terms of you, how you became a regenerative catalyst. I think some people in the room might know it, but people that are tuning in haven't heard of you before might be interested in your journey to dedicating your life to a regenerative world.
Okay, so how long do we have? Because it was quite a long one.
Say 5 minutes or so.
Okay. So I guess I have always been interested in change. Even when I was a little girl, I would stay up at night and look out of the sky and look at the stars and try to understand things like how big is here, how big is forever, and give myself nightmares and my parents nightmares too. But most of my work in many ways has somehow been about change. So I started out in international development, working for the government of Tanzania out of the Scandinavian countries. And international development is and was, even then, which was a long time ago, about funneling money to places in the world that in order to create some kind of change. And within 5 years, I had pretty much worked out that it didn't actually empower change. It just kept people locked in a system of dependency and didn't create any sense of agency at all. So at the same time, the man that I was married to, who was a quantum physicist, I wish I'd paid more attention, because it took me another 40 years to learn what he knew then. His life was tough. He could see what was coming that we're only working with now, and he didn't cope with that very well. So I found myself back in the UK, where for some bizarre set of circumstances, I fell into brand strategy and communication, and very quickly set up my own agency and spent the next 15 to 17 years, I think, supporting consumer brands to grow, brands like, but I was lucky in that I worked with, in the early stages, really progressive kind of brands for the 1980s. So I worked for 20 years for Avon, Chouinard, Patagonia, Timberland, even with a lot of the Virgin enterprises who were very trying to do something different in the 80s and 90s. And then really started to look outside of that world and see, you could start to see the trajectory of where climate was going, where that sustainability, which became part of our work, wasn't really working at all. So I sold the agency and, as you do, carried on consulting for a few years, getting increasingly disappointed about the work I was doing, turning around big oil tankers like Levi Strauss or Glaxo, or it was interesting work, but not soulful work in any way. And then, as luck would have it, two fairly dramatic things happened in relatively quick succession. I was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma, which was supposed to be terminal. I'm not a ghost, I'm still here. But that meant I had to stop working, and it gave me time to start an exploration that I think of as my informal PhD that has been going on for almost 15 years now and still isn't finished. And I just started to look at different fields that I thought might be interesting: developmental psychology, biomimicry, participatory democracy, participatory process, systems. Started off at Donella Meadows looking at systems thinking, and again felt that wasn't really commensurate with where systems needed to go. Studied living systems, and then another fairly dramatic incident happened. The farm that I was living on, you watch the weather patterns when you care for land. You become intimately connected to land and to the weather patterns, and it was getting wetter and wetter. And one Christmas Eve flooded very dramatically, 8 centimeters 1 second, 8 foot the next, and my entire home, my horses, everything disappeared under a wall of water in the dark. And it stayed for 8 weeks, at the end of which, I was mentally in a very, very bad place. And interestingly, if any of you have ever studied the intelligent Enneagram, not the one that focuses only on personalities, there is a really ancient theory of change that says a system needs 2 successive shocks, an internal and an external one. So I guess I had my 2. And it was at that moment, I guess, that I really committed to, I need to find what is going to I didn't even use the word regenerate then. What is going to be commensurate with the polycrisis that we're facing, and what is mine to do within that? That might have been more than 5 minutes, but that's about as short as I can make it. There were an awful lot of other triumphs and disasters in the journey, but let's keep it to those.
Well, I think it's interesting that those 2 personal crises, as it were, is what catalyzed your new commitment to systemic change. I think some people might consider working for purpose brands like Timberland and Patagonia the kind of epitome of what you could realize in a mainstream job. What was it that was dissatisfying for you about working for those for-purpose brands? Or what was it that made you feel that more was needed?
Well, I think when I sold the agency, there was also a point, I was always very clear. The morning I woke up and wasn't loving what I was doing anymore, I'd always change, and I've always done that.
Yeah.
And I felt to a certain extent in growing many household names and brands, I'd done everything there was to do. And the looming digital world was coming, which was going to make some significant changes. And even though I continued to do ad hoc work for those brands, and I have enormous time, particularly for Yvonne, for what he has done, I felt called to a different field, to work in a different field. There is also the anybody that studies globalization of brands or any form of system, you understand the lock-ins.
Yeah.
That these are organizations that are full of really good and wonderful people. All organizations are. They're full of a few strange varieties. But the organizational design is very locked into the neoliberal economic model.
Yeah.
It's hard for them to engage in transformative change. They will always be engaging in incremental change. And I just deeply felt that something different was needed. I didn't know what, but something different.
Well, hopefully, I'd like to get on to that difference for you a little bit later on. But given that you've been on that journey, I was curious about how you landed as place as being the kind of ultimate, I think it was said, acupuncture point for transformative change. How did you arrive into that conclusion? How did you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, Dave, how it actually happened. And we all create stories in our heads about how things happen. But I think it was probably a confluence of a number of different things. So the study of living systems and how living systems evolve, the study of evolution, makes it fairly clear, if you go deep and long enough, that life on the blue dot organizes itself in fractals of place, in nested relational fractals of place. Different fractals of place, bioregional, ecosystemic, ecozone, whatever terminology we want to use. But there is something about how life creates the conditions conducive to life and has done for 3.8 billion years that is place-centric, whatever fractal of place you choose to work from. That alone wasn't entirely enough. I think there was something about looking at the human economic and cultural systems too, that was also important, to really, one, try to reduce the challenge of complexity in some way. Doesn't reduce it a great deal, but when you come back to place, come home to place, there is a degree of complexity that you can weed out. You're not trying to change global systems. You're trying to design and create new life-centric systems from a different geography and landscape. The third was that real deep sense that globalization has stripped what is unique and beautiful from the world, homogenized it, standardized it, so that I can go to any major city in the world and still find Chanel and Prada. And but you know, that's a superficial thing. If you look at food, even that critical role of standardization. Any pot of tomato sauce you buy in any supermarket comes from just 5 strains of tomatoes. And they are the least nutrient dense, most tasteless tomatoes, but they're the toughest. So the global food system, to ensure supply, works with those 5 tomatoes. But tomatoes are beautiful and varied and wonderful and great sources of fiber and nutrition when they are grown locally in the soil that is local, so that you're imbibing the microbes that belong to the place that you live in. So there was definitely something there, and also really just the visceral nature of, we have to confront our deepest inner selves over the garden fence, in place with real people. That is where we test our inner development in a really visceral way.
Yeah.
So for all those complex reasons, and suddenly almost like a download, I spent many years doing that. Okay, I have so much knowledge splitting in my head. What am I going to do with this? What is mine to do? Where is my focus? Almost to the point of insanity, I think. At one point in time, I literally just thought it would never come, it would never land. And then one day it just did.
And you're reminding me of, actually, there was a school of trend of thought, I think, when you were beginning your journey around transition towns, and making local places resilient to shock and crisis and chaos. So I think there's some similarity in thinking of thought there. How would you say what you do relates or doesn't to, say, the Transition Town Initiative?
Well, it's interesting. Okay, so transition towns, as many people will know, grew out of Totnes.
Yeah.
And so there's something really important. I wanted to do a little sidewind about place readiness.
Yeah.
So in Totnes has been, until very recently, a wonderful educational establishment called Schumacher College that was founded there. I'm not exactly sure what year it was, by a wonderful visionary man called Satish Kumar. And many of us in the regenerative field have moved and flowed through Schumacher, including myself at some point in time, and we all owe a deep debt of gratitude to the college for being a place that was prepared to sit on the edge of transformative change and give people like me and many others a home in which to explore. But the fact that it was there created the priming conditions for other initiatives to arise, of which Transition Towns was one.
Right.
And Transition Towns was really focused on energy as a flow, and exploring how from place we could transform energy systems to becoming less impactful and more sustainable and more resilient in the future. But I would say the work that really Regenerative does is less focused on a single flow.
Right.
And more on what is it that needs to happen in each unique, bioculturally unique place to realign human economic and cultural systems to the living systems principles that have sustained life.
Yeah.
And I guess we do that in a number of very small, probably quite insignificant ways. Is we are a learning center, so people can come and join our learning journeys, of which Power of Place is our signature learning journey that incorporates a lot of wisdom that we have I've discovered over the years with organizations like Schumacher, but also like Regenesis, that has a story of place, understanding place in it. It also has a process for being in getting back into right relationship, which in current language we call stakeholder engagement. Beautiful phrase, don't like it. And then the sort of strategic design element of change is how do you get from one state to a future state? But we also partner with place-based organizations on their journey to wanting to become regenerative or design a regenerative economy, transform mindset, whatever it is that takes. And we also I wouldn't describe us as a research center, but we convene and we host inquiry and dialogue about core issues for other organizations. And we do also do research, or in that, we have just finished a piece of research for a philanthropic foundation in the UK, which is really all about saying, what are the conditions and capabilities that would enable place-based community-led regeneration to happen. And we looked at Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, South America, Central America, and the US to see what could be learned from other geographies outside of the UK that could be shared. So those are, so I guess, Transition Towns was very inspiring to me from the way in which it was really remarkably good at convening fields of energy in place, convening community to work for change. And that is, that's also a really important part of our work, is how do you bring fields of energy into being? They're always there, but how do you gather them together, and what helps them hold the process together during the turbulence of transformative change? How do they resist the invisible, you might call it drag of system as usual, which is in all of us? And how do they form to become what I would describe as real centers for transformative change? And centers can be social movements, but they can also be really physical centers like Schumacher that hold the space for educational transformation, biomaterials-based economy, all sorts of. I'm not sure that answered your question. I might have gone off on a tangent.
No, I think I've forgotten my question too, but I think there's something interesting there about right relationship. to place, because of course a right relationship, the notion of that sort of comes to Buddhism, and it's sort of like the Eight Noble Truths, and they're very much internally focused on internal development towards enlightenment. But I'm curious about what you've discovered about right relationship to place, to the energies, to the people, to the fractals that you were describing in there. How would you, what would you crystallize in the learning there? How would you crystallize and share that learning with us?
Oh, again, how long do we have? There's something really important, I think, about understanding and responding to the degree of place readiness.
Yeah.
That is really important, whilst also staying in a place of regenerative design and development, which is incredibly hard, but something that is really important for regenerative practitioners. How do we hold the paradox of keeping ourselves in right relationship to what is regenerative to living systems and work in the world that is? And understanding, I try to make the language a bit more simple sometimes. So I have slight arguments with my senior colleagues in the regenerative field who don't like that, but I try. Without diluting the power of regenerative work. That's the critical thing. It's not about, it's about not diluting its potential. But to go back to the subject of Totnes, transition towns could come out of Totnes because that place had a lot of cultural scaffolding and preparedness to birth something like that. It might not have come out of somewhere else because that place would not have had the cultural scaffolding that enabled it to birth something like transition towns. And I think you have to have the sensibility to recognize that what a place is ready to do, where it's ready to go, while still holding the integrity of what is regenerative in your heart and in your work. And that's, that is challenging. So I'm working with a city in the UK at the moment as part of a collaboratorium that wants to make the city a regenerative learning city. But always in these projects, you are going to have a really deep degree of complexity to manage. You will have multiple different mindsets, and all of us in this room zoom in and out of different mindsets all the time. You are not always a wholly regenerative person or a wholly extractive person. Triggers, circumstances, context, we are a moving feast of complexity in an individual. But in a collective, you'll have multiple different worldviews, multiple different cultures, and multiple different life experiences, multiple different characters and personalities. And the first thing that you have to really stand strong on is, what is the collective understanding of what is regenerative that we're trying to work towards? And our tendency in our current culture is quick, sharp, staccato. We must get into action. We must move. And we must, because there is urgency. But there are two phrases that I absolutely love that I wish were mine, and they weren't. One came from Bayo Akamalafe, who said, you know, the times are urgent, let's go slowly. And one from that came from a colleague in the UK, which is thoughtful urgency. What is it to have thoughtful urgency? So again, there are so many lessons, but one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to is the relationship between urgency, doing, time, and discernment. How how do we balance all of those things in our sense making and decision making in place, or anywhere for that matter, knowing that we can't be right, but wanting to make the best decisions and take the best action on the most powerful nodal acupuncture points we can with our limited understanding of what it is to be really regenerative, which incidentally is why we called our organization Really Regenerative, not because we think we are, because we're always asking the question, what is it to be really regenerative? And we still don't have the answer. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
I think that I think this comes out of your work, this forming communities of inquiry. I love the urgency.
Thoughtful urgency.
Sorry, yeah.
Thoughtful urgency.
Thoughtful urgency, but also discrimination and the other two qualities you mentioned.
Mandeep Kaur of Civic Square said that. It's her phrase, not mine.
And I just wanted to finish up because it was in the title of the talk around potential. So we talked about energies, and we've talked, and very much the urgent rational mindset wants to apply quick solutions to move on in a linear direction. But the potential of place is something I know that you speak very eloquently about, and I'd love to hear why potential is important in a regenerative perspective, you know, rather than this rush to solve problems that we're often find ourselves in.
It's interesting because often, you know, when we ask ourselves in Really Regenerative, you know, are we actually having any effect at all? And we, you know, we don't do surveys, we don't do anything like that with participants in Power of Place, but they take away every single time. There are two really strong things that everybody takes away: relationship before task and potential, not problems. Those two things stick with everybody. And anybody who has been through TRP, which is several of you here, will know the answer to this question. So I'll try and give you my little version of it. It comes back to, how does change really happen? Quite possibly not the way most of us think it happens.
Right.
And living systems don't solve problems.
Right.
They evolve. They evolve in a very complex environment through a process of what often seems quite random hit and miss experimentation that is highly contextual at a particular place and time. What emerges. And there is a deep difference somehow in the response from people that is elicited from when you say, shall we work on the problem of air quality? Because what that does, so I've got one of my paintbrushes here, is if everybody holds up their thumb and stares at their thumbnail, what working on problems does is zero in and really focus on a single thing.
Yeah.
But if you do this with your fingers close to your head and let them sort of keep your eyes on them as they move slightly out, you get a very different picture. You can, so where I'm sitting, when I do that, I can see the pictures on my windscreen, my bottle of water, my slightly sorry for itself pot plant in front of me. I can see the whole system in this room. So one of the most important things about focusing on potential, the evolutionary potential of a place, what is the next leap that this place can make in value-adding potential for all life that is here, that changes the energy and the dynamic and enables people to see a much wider and bigger systemic picture. And since we are trying to affect evolutionary potential and transformation in living systems, that is fairly important.
Brilliant. I think that's a great place to end the interview, and then we'll convene the next section.
Okay. I hope I made sense.